Hello, American Studies. Hey, first time I've made a video in about a week, so it's good to be back with you. So today I wanted to talk about the war in the Pacific. This is going to serve two purposes. Number one, it's going to help you fill out that chart on important battles of World War II, and it's also going to help you understand the second half of the second standards question: How did the United States deploy its military in a way to win the war? So today we're going to learn what they did in the Pacific. I put together this little slideshow, kind of outlining the important parts. The thing I kind of like you to know about the war in the Pacific was that it was very, very different than the war in Europe. The war in Europe, I think the Americans and Germans kind of respected one another in terms of fighting soldiers. The war in the Pacific would be way more brutal and savage. And in fact, the whole way of the warrior, or the whole approach called the Bushido Code that the Japanese took, went way back to the samurai. And the samurai, it was worse to give up or to surrender than to die in battle. So the Japanese fought to the end, and in some of the battles that we took place with in World War II, we only took a handful of prisoners. So it was very savage. So I want you to understand that there were two separate wars. There was the war on land and the war by sea. So the Navy would be in charge of doing the battles by sea, and they were led by Admiral Chester Nimitz. Something significant about these battles is they were almost all between aircraft carrier groups, and this was a new phenomenon in World War II. This had never been done before. The land campaigns would be mostly handled by the U.S. Marine Corps, but in some campaigns, the Army units would come in and help after the beaches were taken. The land forces were commanded by General Douglas MacArthur, who was in the Philippines after Pearl Harbor, and he ended up having to leave because the Japanese invaded the Philippines, and we didn't have enough forces there to keep them from winning. So he left and retreated to Australia, and he vowed that "I shall return" was what his famous speech as he left the island. First, let's talk about the Naval War. So the U.S. Navy stopped the Japanese advance south at the Battle of Coral Sea. This is the first aircraft carrier battle in history, even though it was considered a draw because both sides lost about the same number of ships. It was considered a win by the Americans because this was the first time the Japanese had ever been stopped in the Pacific. And it was a wake-up call for the Japanese that they were not going to be able to do anything they wanted. Now, right around the time of Coral Sea, we had cracked the Japanese code, so we actually could tell what they were saying back and forth in their code. So we set a trap. We sent out a bogus code, and through that bogus message, we learned that their next target was going to be Midway Island, which is part of the Hawaiian Islands. It's the island farthest toward Japanese in the Hawaiian archipelago. So we went up northeast of Midway and waited in ambush for the Japanese to approach. And as they attacked the island of Midway to try to take it over, we counterattacked with our carrier forces and ended up sinking 3 aircraft carriers on June 3rd and a 4th carrier on June 4th. And we turned the tide of battle in the Pacific with this one battle. 4 carriers to 1. This was the turning point in the Naval War. We had other battles that were important, but the last major counteroffensive by the Japanese was in the Philippines, called the Battle of Leyte Gulf. This was actually the largest naval battle in history. Some destroyers, cruisers, and battleships did actually participate in this battle, but once again, it was mostly done between aircraft carriers. But after this battle, there was very little left that the Japanese could attack us. We were masters of the Pacific after the Battle of Leyte Gulf. Now, the war on land. First place we attacked the Japanese was the Battle of Guadalcanal in 1942, in August of 1942. This would be the first defeat of the Japanese on any landmass in the Pacific region. So this was significant. Now, there really wasn't a turning point in the Pacific. The Guadalcanal battle was both the first and the turning point. We didn't lose any battles in the Pacific on land. We won every battle we went against the Japanese with. So I do want you to understand that we started this island hopping campaign. And this tactic meant that we would bypass strong points that had a lot of troops and strength and attack a weaker place nearer to Japan. And then we would just isolate that strong point. We wouldn't let them get resupplied, and then they would just end up dying of starvation, or they could surrender if they wanted. But this avoided major casualties for the Americans because we never really went after the Japanese in their strongest held areas. Now, in one instance, though, Iwo Jima was a very strong point. The Japanese had dug caves and caverns under this volcanic island, and they could attack us without us being able to see them. And it was a huge battle. The Marine Corps Memorial trophy statue with the 7 Marines that are raising the flag atop Mount Suribachi is memorialized in Washington, D.C. from that Joe Rosenthal picture that was taken on Iwo Jima. And then the final campaign was the battle for Okinawa. This is an island that's not far from Japan. It's a relatively large island. It was the largest campaign in the Pacific. Based on our casualty rates at Okinawa, we decided that we could not invade Japan. It would just cause too many casualties, both American and Japanese. There were estimates that we would lose over 750,000 soldiers trying to take Japan itself. So with that in mind, Truman decides to drop the atomic bombs to try to end the war. Truman never even knew about the Manhattan Project until after FDR's death, but he quickly, along with his advisors, started contemplating whether or not we should use this bomb to end the war. It was decided after a lot of, communications back and forth that let's try this. So on August 6th, the B-29 called the Enola Gay dropped the first atomic bomb called Little Boy on Hiroshima, destroying the vast majority of the city. No response from Japan. Then 3 days later, even after we dropped leaflets asking them to surrender, that there would be more destruction and devastation, they still didn't surrender. So on August 9th, a second bomb was dropped by a B-29 called Boxcar, and it destroyed. That bomb was codenamed Fat Man. It was a different design, and actually all of our designs going forward of atomic bombs would be based on the Fat Man design. And it destroyed Nagasaki. By the end of the year, over 200,000 Japanese had died from either the bomb itself or the radiation that was present after the bomb. Japan finally decides to surrender, and on September 2nd, aboard the battleship Missouri, the official surrender ceremony took place in Tokyo Bay. So I hope that this helps you understand how the war in the Pacific kind of went from beginning to end, and I hope it helps you with the second